and welcome to a very special evening at Colby, the Fall 2017 William R. and Linda K. Cotter Debate. My name is Patrice Franco, and I'm the Grossman Professor of Economics and Global Studies, and I welcome you on behalf of the Goldfarb Center. Before I introduce tonight's program, I would like to thank my colleague, standing back there, do not leave. Get Amanda back. Amanda. I'd like to thank my colleague, Amanda Cooley. Not only, hold on, yes, we can start there. Not only for her work, along with that of Kim Bard, is Kim in the room? Yes. On our event tonight, but also for 5 years at the epicenter of Goldfarb programming. Amanda is a force of organization and professionalism, melded with a huge heart, always willing to help. We'll formally bid goodbye to Amanda on Tuesday. Happy to have any in the room join us at 4 in the Diamond Atrium. But as her pre-Thanksgiving stealth departure might preclude some of you from attending, please join me in thanking Amanda for her enormous contributions to the Goldfarb Center. Our debate tonight honors the Cotters' 21 years leading Colby, a time of enormous change in the role of Colby as a liberal arts institution on the national and international stage, much like our moment today as we move forward under President Green's leadership. This name debate series, and I wonder if Bill and Linda could wave to the back of the room there. Yes, President and Mrs. Cotter, yes. This name debate series aptly captures Bill and Linda's passionate pursuit of ideas that matter. In the early days of my marriage to my husband, Sandy Maisel, I remember being terrified of dinners at your home. I made sure that the full week before the visit, I would have read the New York Times cover to cover. Yes, and this was before e-readers and iPads, right? For I knew that the conversation would be deep and wide-ranging. Bill would frequently open the conversation, his large smile and kind tone, a cover for the question that hit to whatever we were discussing, whatever issue dominated the headlines of the day. And then Linda, she tended to listen actively for a few moments and then enter with her own probing, perceptive observation. I always left your table a little smarter and with enormous respect for your penetrating intellect and the legacy you've left us here at Colby. So thank you, and thank you for being with us. Bill and Linda, I hope you enjoy tonight's debate, exploring the limits of free speech on campus. It's a topic of principled and practical importance. Freedom of speech is at the heart of academic inquiry. But this right to express one's thoughts can conflict with the rights that others claim to learn and grow in an environment free of harmful rhetoric. As a college, do we have the responsibility to protect individuals against the hate speech of others, or the violence such speech may engender? President Green has led on this issue with a new Colby task force to interrogate this tension. Practically, should we limit the freedom of expression at Colby? Students, and I'm so pleased to see how you're represented on the task force and to have you here tonight, how as a community we think about these questions will deeply frame your time at Colby. We have 3 thoughtful panelists who will provide different views on this question. Our debate is moderated by Neil Gross, the Charles A. Dana Professor and Chair of Sociology at Colby College. We are so lucky to have Neil Gross with us. He's the author of Why Professors Why are professors liberal, and why do conservatives care? And is co-editor of Professors and Their Politics. I especially thank Professor Gross for his hand in helping to shape this evening with our panelists, and I turn the floor over to him. So thank you, Neil, and thank you all for being here.
Good evening, and welcome to the William and Linda Cotter Debate. Our topic tonight, free speech on campuses, should there be any limits? Over the last year or so, a remarkable series of events has played itself out on colleges and university campuses around the country. Often in response to the presence at the school of an incendiary outside speaker, like Milo Yiannopoulos or Richard Spencer, but sometimes in reaction to more routine events like a talk by an academic or even the teaching of a course, students have risen up in protest. In some cases, they've succeeded in stopping or disrupting the planned event. Occasionally, there's been violence, though almost never have students been the perpetrators. Student activists have viewed their protests, especially against white nationalists, as important acts, symbolic and real, part of a broader effort at stemming the rising tide of fascism in America and around the world. Why, student activists wonder, should they stand idly by when their institutions, which claim to value diversity, truth, and tolerance, give a platform to speakers who respect none of those things? And yet, to many other observers of campus life, from generally liberal pundits to conservative critics of higher education, from professors who came of political age during the free speech movement of the 60s to the Attorney General of the United States, the protests appear as something altogether different, a reflection of the very intolerance campus progressives claim to be countering. More than that, they seem to be of a piece with what many have denounced as the new progressive political orthodoxy in American higher education. At a moment when liberal faculty members massively outnumber conservative ones in most fields of study, and when campus speech codes and rules of student conduct sometimes seem written with the intent of prohibiting the expression of conservative thought, is it any surprise, critics ask, that students are primed to shut down not just talks by Nazis, but events by anyone with whose politics they disagree? Should we conclude that free speech is currently under assault on campus by student protesters, by outside agitators? Is the free speech of conservative students threatened by liberal faculty members and administrators? Is the free speech and academic freedom of progressive faculty members threatened by conservative students who report their professors' political comments to the world at large? If free speech is under attack, what's the cost to the student experience, to higher education institutions, to democracy? Or is the free speech framing a red herring, one that distracts attention from the increasing normalization, not just of hate speech, but of hate itself in the US? What exactly is the state of play of these issues? And what might be done to move American higher education and the country forward? These are very big questions indeed, and we are grateful to have three of the nation's leading experts here tonight to help us make our way through them. John Shields, a very smart and wide-ranging political scientist, is Associate Professor of Government at Claremont McKenna College and the co-author of a highly relevant book, Passing on the Right, Conservative Professors in the Progressive University. Laura Beth Nielsen, one of America's finest sociologists of law, is a research professor at the American Bar Foundation and also professor of sociology and director of the Legal Studies program at Northwestern University. She is the author of License to Harass, Law, Hierarchy, and Offensive Public Speech. And finally, John Zimmerman, a major historian of American higher education, is professor of history and education at the University of Pennsylvania. Among his books are Who's America? Culture Wars in the Public Schools, Too Hot to Handle, A Global History of Sex Education, and recently, Campus Politics, What Everyone Needs to Know. In addition to their scholarly works, Professors Nielsen, Shields, and Zimmerman have published extensively in the public sphere on campus politics and speech, among other topics. The setup for our discussion tonight is straightforward. The speakers will talk for about 10 minutes each. I'll then ask a few follow-up questions, and after that, we'll open it up to questions or comments from the floor. I see some of my own students in the audience. I promise to favor them only a little in picking people for the queue. Also, Patrice joked earlier at dinner that she'd be rating the conversation at the dinner table. And in the similar vein, I do promise to be giving everyone in the room a participation grade. And that includes you, President Green, and you, Provost McFadden. I saw you both drinking that second glass of wine at dinner. So now's the time to wake up. Professor Shields will be our first speaker. But before he begins, I hope you'll join me in warmly welcoming our panelists to Colby.
Well, thank you. I want to thank Neil for that gracious introduction. I want to thank Colby College and all of you for coming today. You may have to bear with me a little bit. I took a red eye in from California, and I popped a bunch of pills, which seemed like a good idea at the time. And I didn't sleep very well, and now I'm feeling kind of loopy. So I'm hoping this is coherent. I believe something that might surprise you, given that I am a conservative. I believe that the modern university is one of the greatest achievements of American civilization. In a land that's sometimes derided for its anti-intellectualism or for its reality television, this country has created universities that are the envy of the world. So I love the university. And not just because it cuts me a check every month. The modern university is special, I think, because it pursues truth above other ends. That is its central purpose. And because truth is best pursued in an environment where dissent is encouraged and protected, free speech is critical to the mission of the university. Notice I'm not saying that free speech is just an end in itself. It's not the highest good or purpose of the university. Rather, free speech is at least in part an instrumental good. It's a good that allows us to collectively pursue the truth. This is why professors have tenure. We do not have tenure, as some of my students oppose, as compensation for having to suffer through a long PhD program. Tenure is a good that allows us to collectively pursue the truth. And therefore, tenure contributes to the mission of the university. One of the things that troubles me about some of the defenders of free speech is that they sometimes treat free speech, at least in these contexts over the university, in these debates over the university, sometimes they treat the issue of free speech as a kind of an instrumental good rather than an instrumental one. But because I think free speech on university campuses is at least partly an instrumental good, I think it should be regulated. Indeed, it is regulated all the times in ways that we don't always see. So I'll give some examples. The university, it seems to me, is governed partly by deliberative norms, right, that regulate our speech. In class, students and professors are expected to listen to one another, to be charitable to one another, to be civil. Without those norms, if students and professors were always their authentic selves, if they just said whatever they felt, whenever they felt it, then we couldn't collectively pursue the truth together as a community, right? We'd live in some Trumpian hell of some kind. Here's another example. The university, of course, also regulates speech in and through its centers and institutes like this one. Right? These centers normally try to select speakers who offer serious arguments rather than people who are merely provocateurs or entertainers. The best case against Milo is not that he's a conservative or outrageous or offensive. The best case against him is that he's a buffoon, a carnival act, an utterly unserious thinker. Milo does not help the university's mission because he doesn't help us pursue the truth. So I don't think the mission of the university is simply to recreate the public square, right, as it looks out there. Rather, I think the university should offer us a highly refracted version of that public square, one that exposes students to serious thinkers and controversies, one that offers an elevated version of the public square. One of the things that troubles me, I think, about today's environment is that the campus right is sometimes eager to invite unserious provocateurs to campus, like Milo. Meanwhile, the campus left sometimes sometimes pushes serious thinkers off of campus, right? It's almost as if they're working hand in glove, right? I mean, I sort of get that sense at times, right? They're both, it seems, sort of unwittingly sort of conspiring to undermine a serious intellectual discussion over important controversies. But since this is an elite college, an elite liberal arts college, where conservatives are fairly exotic, at least I've been told this at dinner tonight, I'll focus my final comment on my disagreement with the campus left. There are too many serious thinkers on the right who are being pushed off college campuses. This is an issue that's close to my own heart because I teach at Claremont McKenna College, and last spring we invited Heather McDonald to speak. And on the evening of her talk, students blockaded the entrance, which made it impossible for students to go and engage her. Now, if you're not familiar with Heather McDonald, she's a journalist and a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. The Manhattan Institute is a libertarian think tank in New York City. And she's been interested in trying to explain why crime has increased in a number of American cities in recent years. And that's a sort of interesting mystery because crime has been falling for decades in those places. To account for those changes, McDonald argues that in the wake of the anti-police protest after Ferguson, a number of police departments have retreated from policing strategies that were good at protecting lives. And that retreat has in turn emboldened some of the criminals in those cities who reasonably calculate that they can engage in violence without getting caught. I don't know if McDonald is right. All I know is that she's a serious person. How do I know she's a serious person? Partly because her theory is being taken seriously by criminologists, including liberal ones. Okay. One such criminologist is Richard Rosenfeld, someone who was actually an early critic of McDonald's theory. But as more evidence accumulated, he changed his mind. Now he thinks that some version of McDonald's theory is the leading hypothesis. As he put it, it's the only explanation that gets the timing right. If the mission of the university is to pursue truth, I don't think there's a good reason to push a thinker off campus who has developed a leading theory on crime. The justification for doing so usually rests on the notion that listening to thinkers like McDonald causes psychological harm, especially to those who are racial minorities or disadvantaged. Those arguments, of course, have a certain currency and power on college campuses, especially given the politics of those campuses, and especially given the deep and abiding concern about social justice there. But if we really want to pursue social justice, we must protect the university as a truth-seeking institution. Right? Let's say, for the sake of argument, for example, that McDonald is right. Or let's assume that she's partly right. It doesn't serve the interest, it seems to me, of the poor or the disadvantaged to reject theories that might help us adjust policies in ways that protect them from violent death. On the other hand, maybe McDonald's hypothesis will be refuted and replaced with a better one, right? This is more likely to happen if students and scholars, right, engage her rather than retreat from her evidence and arguments, right? So one of my frustrations, just speaking as a person who teaches, on a different campus, one of my frustrations was I wanted students who wanted to work on this, right, who wanted to write theses on the Ferguson effect, who wanted to challenge her, who wanted to look at new kinds of data. The data's emerging, the new data's emerging, right, every day. I wanted to advise those theses. Now I fear that there will be no such theses written by CMC students on the Ferguson effect. So to conclude, the pursuit of justice requires the best understanding of the social world as we can achieve. And we can't understand the social world well if we don't protect reasonable speech and dissent. So I think the university serves social justice best when it's not its primary mission, right? When its primary mission is pursuing the truth. Then if it remains faithful to that mission, it will serve justice as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for providing a forum for this interesting and important debate. Thank you for having us, and thank you for sponsoring the debate. When you're accustomed to privilege, equality can feel like oppression. Or in the case of speech on campus, when you're accustomed to privilege, movement towards equality can feel like oppression. Like the other speakers, I think free speech is at risk on college campuses, and it's something that we have to pay attention to and foster in an ongoing way on a daily basis. Indeed, like in the so-called real world, there's no such thing as free speech for everyone on every topic all the time. To quote Stanley Fish, there's no such thing as free speech, and it's a good thing too. We all know and largely agree that there are harms that justify regulating speech: conspiracy, inciting lawless action, obscenity, speech that leads to price fixing, insider trading, begging is heavily regulated. And if you think about the workplace, even insofar as Title VII can make actionable mere speech, it is a restriction on speech in favor of our shared social goal of democracy, equality, and opportunity at work. The policy driver here is a conception of harm. In other words, continually harassing an individual in a sexual way in the workplace is not just speech, it is doing something. It is producing a harm. The harm is gender subordination, gender discrimination. It is the harm of perpetuating discrimination. It's the harm of creating inequality. The words, in some circumstances, can be doing the discriminating by degrading white women, people of color, gender nonconforming workers in ways that create inequality, when we know that equality also is a constitutionally protected goal. My first book, License to Harass: Law, Hierarchy, and Offensive Public Speech, is a constitutional and empirical analysis of offensive speech in public places. Now, the speech I study is quite deliberately protected speech. It's constitutionally protected, and yet I'm able to demonstrate harms that are disproportionately borne by white women and people of color. Indeed, if you ask people what it's like to merely walk down the street in the skin and body of someone not like them, they can't even guess what it's like. How often do you think people of color are subjected to racist hate speech in public? White people don't know. How often are women sexually harassed in public? Men can't tell you, although you're getting a good idea in the last month. So just like in these other areas of speech, I'm going to argue that we need to weigh the benefits and burdens when we think as a community about speech. Now, universities. Colleges and universities, even private ones like Colby, are still public places as a matter of constitutional law in a way that we can talk about if you want, but also as a matter of sort of general understanding of space. We have sidewalks, buildings, grassy quads that anyone can traverse. But the university is also a school, a workplace, and it is the home of many people who live there. Of course, our first goal at a university, our core mission, is to educate. We need to learn, to teach, to hear, and take in as many new ideas as we can. And a lot of times, trying to do that involves thinking about these really important social problems. I think I think about speech a little bit differently, because when I think about free speech and solving these social problems, I'm not just thinking about my ability to do speech, to be performatively speaking or realizing my, ultimate goal of talking. I'm also thinking about the ability to hear, listen, engage, and react. Speaking and listening go together. What good is the speech if it can't be heard or if it drowns out other perspectives? So conversations like the ones we're having here emerge from difficult situations, like John said, the Rolling Stone article that ultimately proved to be false at UVA about campus sexual assault, white supremacists on the campus of UVA. But in those moments, we need to think about them not just as chances for some people to speak and our obligations around that. These are opportunities to be heard and progress on these daunting social issues when you orchestrate it a lot like the way that you have orchestrated it here tonight. When we focus only on our own speech, we miss these opportunities. So to make it a real conversation with speaking and listening, we also need to take account of the dynamics in which the conversation takes place. If that means designated safe spaces, women's centers, and trigger warnings in the cases of campus sexual assault, to compensate for the balance of power, I'll argue not just that they're a good thing, but they're a necessary thing for the free exchange of ideas. If the safe spaces aren't provided, some people are not going to be able to join the bigger, broader debate. They want to try their ideas out in a trusted space. But this is only important if we care about the listening and hearing part of speech. Right now, the politics of racial subordination are forefront in thinking about speech, but there are other social issues too, campus sexual assault and Title IX compliance. So let's just think about that example for a moment. I think we all agree, left and right, that campus sexual assault and campus responses to it are serious social problems. Whether you think, as people characterized as being on the left might do, that the problem is massive underreporting of campus sexual assault, which the peer-reviewed empirical research consistently demonstrates, or as characterized as the right argument. I actually have both of these arguments, so I don't know, I don't know what I am. But even if so there's the argument on the left that the problem is massive underreporting, or if you think the university's failures of processes for protecting accused rapists, like the Harvard Law School faculty is famous for arguing, we can probably all agree that this is a serious social problem and there's work to be done at the university. And here we are in a place where we know a lot about the subject, and yet we find it very difficult to have conversations about it. We need to understand not just the social science of sexual assault, that about 1/4 of women report being sexually assaulted in their college years. We also have to understand how that is experienced by targets, mostly, but not exclusively, women. 5% of men report being sexually assaulted during their time in college. So what is the status for women and gender nonconforming individuals? Well, women occupy a subordinated status vis-a-vis men in the US society, I hate to tell you. Law enforcement remains overwhelmingly dominated by men, as are the legal institutions, which in the case of rape, doubly bend in favor of the party who tends to be male because of our burden of proof. Not a critique, just beyond a reasonable doubt standard, just an observation that bends male. Women make less money, do more of the caring work, are excluded at the high end of the major professions, and are disproportionately burdened by workplace sexual assault. What kind of speech debates emerge in this kind of campus sexual assault contest? There have been lots of reported incidents, and you can go see them on YouTube, of the infamous chant offered by older male students outside of gendered female dorms. No means yes, and yes means anal. When we talk about punishing that speech, or if you prefer the Charlottesville chant of Jews will not replace us, when we think of that as just speech without considering the equality we want to achieve on the campus environment for the women who are being told that no means yes, the equality component, the equality constitutional argument is lost. Given all of this, it's not surprising that some targets of sexual assault feel they can't be part of the conversation, and they're disproportionately women. But the exclusion of their participation in the conversation means we're missing one of the most important perspectives when we talk about this other major problem that we face on university campuses. Finally, it's important to put the new medical and social science research about the harms of subordination into this conversation. New and emerging research is very consistent, beginning to show strong relationships between discrimination, microaggressions, and racialized violence with physical diseases like hypertension, inflammation associated with higher cortisol levels, which leads to all kinds of inflammatory diseases, arthritis, and so on, as well as psychological disorders like depression, anxiety, and PTSD. So when these difficult questions come up about who should speak and when and where, as leaders, we need to model civil discourse. Actually, I think having a meal before you talk about these things is really important, so I applaud you. Healthy disagreement, analysis of the best available data that we ourselves are producing about the harms of the speech and the speech itself. Now, this is not an argument for restriction, but I'm offering the plea that there be a recognition that allowing some kinds of speech creates harms. And we need to decide affirmatively, thoughtfully, and mindfully either that there's a greater good, it's pursuing truth, and that we want to do it anyway, and to consider things we can do to remedy the kinds of harms that we should be taking seriously that our students tell us they suffer. So I'm happy to talk about concrete specifics beyond dinner, but for now I will say thank you for listening.
For the lovely introduction, and thanks to Colby for bringing me here, and thanks to all of you for coming out. I'm just going to conclude there's not a lot to do in Waterville. I mean, there are a lot of you here, which is great. Thank you. And on a more personal, historical note, it's also a great honor to be here celebrating the Cotters. I'm a historian, but I'm also a journalist. And after this awful tragedy at Penn State involving Tim Piazza, the kid who died in the fraternity, I wrote a piece in the Philadelphia Inquirer saying, I think it's time that Penn State does not have fraternities. And of course, I got about 1,200 very angry emails from Nittany Lions. And a lot of them said, well, look, even if you wanted to do that, you could never do that. You could never get rid of fraternities. And look, Pat Moynihan said everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts. If you want to argue that my opinion is wrong, you can, and I might listen to you. But if you want to say, as a matter of fact, you can't get rid of fraternities, you're actually wrong. And this institution is a great example of that. That's largely because of the courage and dedication that Bill Cotter showed during a very difficult time in the history of this institution. I'm just delighted to be here celebrating that with him. Look, I don't. How can I put this? I'm going to be sort of the wet blanket in this discussion because I'm going to begin by suggesting that we all take a chill pill, okay? Yes, there's a problem. I wouldn't be here if there wasn't. But there is no crisis of free speech on our campuses, okay? Look, I'm a tenured professor at a major research university. I have enormous free speech. The kind of things I'd have to do to get fired, I can't even say. All right? I mean, that's how bad they are, okay? And on a more serious note, you know, those of us who teach at and attend elite schools have no idea what kind of bubble we live in. There are 4,000 places to get a BA in the United States, and most of them look nothing like the University of Pennsylvania and nothing like Colby College, all right? Half of the undergrads in the United States attend a community college. A quarter of them are 25 or older. A quarter of them have a kid. And in most of these places, the stuff we're talking about tonight, trigger warnings and microaggressions, it's like I'm trying to do 2 jobs, get my degree, and put food on the table. All right? It's not an issue. For us, though, it is an issue. And what I try to do, friends, when I talk about this subject is try to find a language that acknowledges the problem without exaggerating it. All right? There is a problem, absolutely, especially our elite schools. And I think the problem is borne out in a couple of very good studies suggesting that the longer that students are at an elite school, the less free they feel in what they can say. As a university professor, I just can't handle that. I can't handle the idea that anybody in one of my classes, or even outside one of my classes, feels inhibited to express an opinion, either inside or outside of the class. Frankly, I think anybody who's a university professor should be alarmed by that. Not everybody feels that way, but some people do. Also, I think that there's compelling evidence to suggest that faculty inhibit what they think as well. When I was doing my book on campus politics, and by the way, Neil Gross wrote a lovely blurb for that book, and he thereby became the first person that's not a blood relative to read the book. Although I think somewhere back in the shtetl, Neil and I were probably related. We sewed the same shirt. The thing I was most surprised when I was doing that book was to discover that 40% of full-time faculty at American colleges and universities oppose the use of race and ethnicity in college admissions. Now, I should tell you for the sake of transparency that I'm very much in the 60%. I think that in sum, affirmative action has been a great boon for our colleges and universities, and this room would not look like it does without it. But I understand it's a hotly contested and extremely difficult and complicated question. And I was upset when I learned this, not because there are people that think differently from me, but because I don't really hear them. I don't hear that 40% talking very loudly. That cannot be good for the university. It can't even be good for affirmative action, which could only, I think, flourish, prosper, with a more full-throated debate. So to me, that's the, quote, threat. I think it's got a lot of roots, but one of them, to pick up on the earlier comments, has to do with what I call the psychologizing of politics. To me, that is one of the most troubling dimensions of political discourse on campus. Now, by the psychologizing of politics, I mean the framing of political claims in psychological terms. Friends, I'm not against psychology. My family and I have been great beneficiaries of psychology, okay? But I do not think that psychology and politics play very well together. If you tell me you were microaggressed by something I said tonight, and maybe you were, here's what I have to say in reply. Sorry. I got nothing after that. I really don't. I can't say you weren't. I can't look into your soul and tell you what you're feeling. Friends, when I give this rap, very often people say, you're denying our feelings. No, it's precisely the undeniability of your feelings that make them such a lousy venue for political discussion. I am not denying them, I am asserting their undeniability. And it's because of that quality that they provide a very poor venue for discussion. Secondly, I think that psychology of politics lends itself to all sorts of ahistorical claims about free speech itself. So after the elections, I was so frankly upset, not just by, to be as transparent as possible, the outcome of the election, but by the poor quality of discussion surrounding it, that I brought in Mary Beth Tinker. Now, any of you who know about free speech should recognize that name because Mary Beth Tinker was a member of the family that wore the black armbands protesting the Vietnam War. They went into their school in Des Moines, Iowa. They were told to go home. This worked its way up to the Supreme Court, and in 1969, in Tinker v. Des Moines, Justice Fortas upheld their right to wear those armbands and famously said that neither students nor teachers, who I always forget about, shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gate. Mary Beth Tinker is even older than me, if you can imagine that. But she kindly came up from Washington to come to meet with my class on the history of American education. And she does her rap about Tinker v. Des Moines, and first hand goes up and says, "Look, Miss Tinker, you were fighting the good fight. You were fighting the war. This guy, Milo Yiannopoulos, all right, not only is he a clown, as my friend John Shields said, but he actually injures people with his anti-gay, even though he's gay, anti-trans, racist, and sexist rhetoric. He hurts people. That's what he does." Mary Beth Tinker wasn't having it. All right? She said, "Dude, listen to me. I went to a school with people who had dads and brothers that were fighting and dying in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Do you think they weren't hurt? Do you think they weren't injured by this snot-nosed kid walking around with this armband saying that what they were fighting and dying for was a mistake? You don't think that hurt them? Damn straight it did. It did. It does. It must. Well then, having been introduced by some of their other professors to some warmed-over Foucauldianism, my students then went to the power argument. They said, "Oh, Ms. Tinker, this isn't this free speech thing. This is just some sort of weird social construct, and really this whole battle is just about power. Who's got it and who doesn't, right? Who's on top and who's on the bottom?" She wasn't having that either, all right? She said, "Dude, I was a 13-year-old kid. I had no power. My speech was the only power I had. That was it." And the worst part of the psychologizing of politics is the ahistoric way it makes us forget that across our history, the people at the bottom were the ones that needed this. It was and remains all they had. Every great warrior for this thing called social justice in our history was also a warrior for freedom of speech. You name it, baby. Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony, W.B. Du Bois, Carrie Chapman Catt, Martin Luther King, each and every one of them, because they knew that that was all they had. And don't kid yourself. Don't think you have all the answers, and don't think now that because you're on top that one day you won't be on the bottom. You will be. You will be. All right? So you go ahead and tell somebody else that their statement is too offensive, too harmful, too injurious. Go ahead and do it. But just get ready. Just get ready for the day that your statement, whatever it is going to fall into the same category. And then you're going to be singing another tune completely. So don't be seduced by that. Please don't. Look, everything the speaker said before is correct. No speech is absolute, including freedom of speech. We know this, okay? But, friends, once you start saying that what I said is just as offensive as Milo, where exactly does that end? Some of you might actually believe that, and that's cool. It's a free country, all right? And in fact, some of you might say I'm worse than Milo. Think about it, all right? Milo was a clown, all right? Me, I come in here with my tie, I teach at Penn. I'm a big macher. I'm worse than him. I'm worse because I opened the door for him. I opened the gate for him. All right? Muzzle me too. I'm worse than him. I'm worse. Friends, look, the problem really isn't free speech, okay? The problem, actually, is the low quality of political exchange in our country and on our campuses. I take what John Shields said very seriously. Our universities should not echo what happens outside. All right, I'm time? Yeah. Let me just close with this. If my wife were here, she would say, you know, you really talk too much. But look, if what you do is you turn on the television and you watch what's called a debate, it isn't one. It's not. Susan and I will watch TV at night, and they'll announce they're going to have a debate about DACA or whatever it is, and all you see are people ranting and shouting past each other. That's what we're socializing people to think that discussion is. We're at an incredibly difficult and polarized moment in the history of our country. I think the job of our schools and universities is to teach a better way to exchange, and I don't think we're stepping into the moment. Thanks a lot.
Well, that was terrific, and I jotted down a question for each of you, and maybe we can just go through and you can give your thoughts, and perhaps the responses of one panelist will lead others to think something differently. So for John Shields, my question had to do with your example of Heather McDonald, the journalist who argues that there has been a Ferguson effect. You made the point that having her on campus was essential for the pursuit of truth, to expose your students to her ideas, whether they're right or wrong. That was important to you. My question was why having her on campus was so important. Can't your students just read her writing to learn about her ideas? Why is the presence of different voices on campus such an essential part of a higher education experience?
So does this mean I can go home now, Neil? Since yeah, it's a good question. Well, I think for lots of undergraduates, it's I think one reason is because of the political tilt of the university. And so to have centers who bring in people who are center-right or heterodox or otherwise, you know, have a politics that's such that, so I don't think, it's not as if Heather McDonald is widely assigned at the Claremont colleges, right? And nonetheless, she's got this theory that's getting a lot of attention and it's being debated. And so one of the things I find troubling about college campuses is that some of the most interesting debates aren't really being played out on campus, right? Students aren't getting exposed to them. And so they're not hearing from people like Heather. Now, if it was the case that, right, Heather was assigned all the time and people knew her well, there would be, I suppose, there'd be a stronger case for, you know, that she wouldn't, right, be such an important person there. But in fact, I think Heather actually, it's sort of weird we invited her. Nobody invites Heather, right? Nobody does. And that is, I think, a fact that doesn't reflect well on higher ed.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So, Laura Beth, my question for you was a little different. I mean, I thought that your framing of the free speech issue in terms of the potential for real harm to certain kinds of words was really intriguing. I was hoping to kind of push you a little bit further to ask, what's the balance that you think colleges and universities should be aiming for? I mean, you've framed your comments as sort of pointing out that there actually is, there are issues on both sides here that are worth taking seriously. So how would you have colleges and universities make the decision about what speech to allow and what speech not to allow?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and I think a lot of it comes down to the way in which it's presented. I mean, I guess we all agree that sort of a Milo Yiannopoulos kind of character is not really contributing to actual truth and knowledge. Maybe people want to invite him for performative reasons, but I think it's not about what you allow and don't allow. It's how you create an environment where you do listen to the people about the psychological harms that it might be causing them, or the physical harms that the increasing medical research shows it has or can have for some people, and you listen to their speech. This is what I need to be able to process this argument. Maybe I need a seminar about it. Maybe I want faculty of color to lead a discussion just for students of color about it. And so instead of just, instead of the, well, please tough it out, I would argue we need to listen to the speech of the people saying there's a harm, and here's what I think the university could do to help. Now, undergrads might not have, a million ideas about how to do this, but we have all the education research and at our fingertips to be able to provide ways to model dealing with and engaging in complicated and complex debates.
I couldn't agree more, but I think we need to have a debate about the nature of the harms that you're talking about. And my fear is that if we begin with a prima facie idea that they are harms, we won't have that debate. So is there medical research about the
Yes.
cumulative effect of racism?
Absolutely.
There absolutely is. But since we mentioned microaggressions, the research base about microaggressions is extremely thin. So Scott Lilienthal just did a really deep dive on this that you might have seen. He's a psychologist at Emory. And what he found out is that among minority groups, there is zero consensus on what constitutes a microaggression. So you get a bunch of minorities together, and then you have somebody say something. There's no consensus among the minorities about what microaggression is. Secondly, he couldn't find any shared effect of microaggressions. So he couldn't find that the same minorities who had heard something, even something that they all said was a microaggression, experienced it in the same way or were harmed in any way that he could measure. Now remember, that doesn't mean it's not true, but that's not the way this is supposed to work. Universities are about knowledge, and I thought that we're supposed to work according to knowledge. The best knowledge now about microaggressions is we don't have knowledge about microaggressions.
So we should be
Okay.
talking about them and studying them.
Exactly, right? But not using them as a prima facie way to cut off discussion about things including microaggressions themselves. There may be somebody in the audience right now that was just microaggressed by my critique of microaggressions.
Right, and
It
I'd be
wouldn't-
interested to hear about it.
It wouldn't surprise me. And look, like I said, I'm sorry, but that's not going to make for much of a discussion, right? We're going to have to talk about, what we've discovered about microaggressions and what we haven't.
Do you mean that you're sorry?
Sorry?
Do you mean that, I mean, and
Definitely. I never want to hurt anybody.
So then
Do
would you
you?
want to hear, no, so then would you want to hear back so that you might be able to think about framing your argument in a different way that didn't microaggress people? Because I'll tell you,
Sure.
if it's microaggressing, they're not learning. Right? There's a ton of education research. When people feel threatened, they are not learning. And so if we're going to talk about it in the university context, I think the sorry can't just be, well, I know we've devolved, but it can't just be sorry. It has to be sorry and tell me more about that.
Definitely.
Okay, good. I'm glad you mean the sorry.
John, my question for you actually follows pretty nicely from this discussion. I mean, I thought it was very intriguing that you began your comments very, very appropriately by pointing to the diversity of American higher education and the fact that many students don't have educational experiences that look like those that the students here at Colby are getting. But that led me to think a little bit more about a question that would be as relevant to the community college students you profiled as it would be to quite a few students at more elite institutions. And that is whether the idea of microaggression is really a kind of minimizing idea. I mean, for many of the students, I think, at community colleges, but also for example, a number of first-generation students at elite institutions, I mean, their experience of being at the bottom of the social structure is an experience of macroaggression.
Yes.
And it's not that comments made in class might, sort of trigger them, but I mean, but the suggestions, the political suggestions that might be made on one side of the aisle have, if carried out, would have direct bearing on their lives, the lives of their families, the lives of their communities. And so I wonder whether the phrase microaggressions, again, sort of minimizes what for many people is, speech that could have real political implications, especially in the current political climate.
Look, yes, it seems to me that especially right now, for all the reasons you're describing, there's all kinds of speech that comes out of Washington every day that I think depending on your place in the social structure, depending on your personal history, depending on who you are, could be devastating to you. I have felt devastated at times, but I still think the language of trauma is the wrong language for this. Trauma is a medical term. It has a rather precise meaning. And after the election, on my campus, there were huge meetings about the trauma that all of us had suffered because of the election of Donald Trump. I was devastated by that outcome. I yield to nobody in my loathing of Trump, but I was not traumatized by it. And I would challenge the people who say they are to go to a battered women's shelter or go to a refugee center for Syrian refugees and say, I feel you, we've all been traumatized. Once we start stretching those words beyond where they should go, I feel that we do a real danger to the meaning of the term. It's like when my students call something a lynching. I always say, look, whatever you're talking about, I'm sure it sucked. But if you think it was a lynching, you got to read more about lynching. Because it wasn't, right? And once you call everything a lynching, what you're going to do is you're going to erode the meaning and the power of the term.
Well, we have, I think, a few minutes left for comments from the audience, and we can just have you raise your hands, and I'll try to call on you. Great, Niall. Oh.
Hang on 1 second there. Okay, so just speak up loudly.
Well, I don't know. Prey, do you want to go, and then Niall? Yeah, okay.
Can you make it a little more concrete? Give us a concrete example of what you have in mind.
Right, like speech in the workplace. I mean, you know, we think about the workplace, and we kind of agree on Title VII. I think, aside from you know, one constitutional scholar at UCLA, but right, if you're continually asked if you're the custodian or the receptionist in your workplace, you're continually being given the message, you don't belong, you aren't the professional, and it's the same thing at a university. We want to be really, and I'm not arguing that either of those causes trauma, but I would argue that the people who were traumatized by Donald Trump's election might have been the people who recently left a battered women's shelter or a Syrian refugee camp. But I think I see what you're talking about, which is this question of when these things are continually happening, it creates this feeling of not belonging, which is, we know, going to prevent you or people from moving along in their daily workplace. So you're really talking about like what in sociology we would call a sort of a broader theory of racial hierarchy or gender hierarchy. And so it's not about the individuals, it's about the structures that create assumptions about the individuals and inabilities to move on. And that's why it's important to talk about, I think.
Thank you. Niall.
So my question is more so about the roles that professors should play in regards to personal injury, as Shields talked about. Shields, this is probably more specific to you, but generally everyone. If you believe that free speech is a tool in which to pursue truth, I feel like they're one of the options that a professor can take. The first one would be to not introduce their own personal opinions. The third option being someone actively choosing to go against their own opinion in order to represent the lesser opinion. Which of those three options do you think professors should partake in to actively pursue truth?
That's a great question. I mean, I've done different things, and I'm not sure I know, what the best, how best to proceed. I think what you don't want to do, of course, is to be, very dogmatic and heavy-handed and sort of shut students down, of course. But I don't think that one needs to conceal your politics, right? I mean, I know a lot of students sort of have that sense that professors should be closeted all the time, essentially. And I think maybe John has pointed this out before. I think one consequence of that, perhaps, is that if you're totally closeted about your things that matter to you, about your politics, it does tend to push students away a little bit. You're sort of keeping them at a distance. And so I guess these days, I'm a little bit more open with my students. But if I express a view, I tend to emphasize it's contestable. Right? There are good reasons not to believe this. That this is not the gospel truth. And I often say, look, I've been wrong a lot before. I'm wrong all the time. And I think one thing professors could do is just be more humble around their students, right? The really tragic thing about being a human being, it seems to me, is that we get things wrong despite our best efforts to get them right? And we do this a lot. And so I guess I'm sort of in favor of being not totally closeted, being open, but doing it in a way that it sort of aggressively signals that this is a conversation. And one obvious way to do that is through the readings. Because I think the one way professors really cheat is through the readings, right? They say, look, this is, right, this is the universe for you. And sometimes that's a very narrow one. And then they can sort of pretend like they're this impartial Weberian sort of mind, right? And so that's something I think students should watch out for. But I think there's lots of ways to signal to students that you are a person, that professors, we're people, we have opinions, but we're not dogmatists. We're trying to open your minds.
So Alexander Michaeljohn, who was the leading civil libertarian of the early 20th century, he had this great line, which I've often used in response to this question, which is, slaves can't teach freedom. So if what you're trying to do is model some of the values that we've been describing tonight, how are you going to do that if you pretend that you're this kind of neutral Olympian figure rather than a political actor in your own right? But in the same breath, Michaeljohn went on to caution that you have to be an educator rather than a propagandist. An educator being somebody that helps other people search for truth, and a propagandist being somebody that imposes her or his own. And so when you do express a political opinion, like John was saying, you have to make it clear that it is your opinion and it's not on a mosaic tablet. You believe it for the following reasons, but lots of other very fine, decent, and smart people think otherwise. And to go to your third option, which hasn't been mentioned yet, I think that's hugely important. That is to try to represent views that you don't hear represented in the room. So when I go to the gym, I only watch Fox News, exclusively. And the reason is that
it's just an hour of pain for you.
Yeah, I'm a liberal Democrat, And if I watch CNN or MSNBC, all I'll hear are things that confirm my view of the world. But watching Fox or reading the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal equips me very well as a teacher, because then if I don't hear the Wall Street Journal's view expressed in the class, I can represent it. Not always perfectly, but I certainly try to.
I think there are a lot of really concrete things you can do also. So we were talking about this at our dinner table. I use clickers in the classroom, and I ask people's opinions on controversial topics, say abortion. And when the graph comes up on the screen and they see, oh, a third of the other students are also pro-life, right? We might be 60% or whatever, 70% pro-choice, but that gives, I think, a strength in numbers feeling to articulate a minority viewpoint that we're talking about. I also have office hours off campus where we're only allowed, they're called idea office hours or fun office hours. And a lot of times I'll play out a conversation with somebody who I know has a different political opinion than I do, and then I'll draw it out in class. And so they've had the conversation with me in a smaller environment, or maybe in office hours. They know I think they're making valid points. And I say, hey, can we do this exchange in the classroom? And I read the other side stuff, and I will present it, but and I will add on if they're not making the full Wall Street Journal argument or whatever. I'm not going to make a Nazi argument or a Richard Spencer argument. I'm not going to do that, but I'll point them to things if they want to read about it. So I think I don't think it's useful to try to hide it, but I think it's useful to try to foster the feeling of safety in the classroom for people to express it, and that's by giving them a chance to practice, by showing them there are other students in the room that share that opinion, and by taking them seriously. I know which of my students voted for Trump, and on the day he got elected, one of the things I could feel good about was that that guy right there was happy. He sat right, I mean, you fought, and he hugged me and said, I know you're losing your mind.
I want to make just a very quick argument, if I can, for not displaying your politics in the classroom. And I don't know that I actually do this, but I think that there is a case to be made now more than in a very long time for creating knowledge institutions that people can trust for their nonpartisanship. I think we're seeing this play out very much in the realm of journalism, but we're certainly seeing it playing out in the halls of the hard sciences as well. And I think that universities could do worse than to model for students that there are some topics, even heated social and political topics, on which the appropriate response at a particular time isn't necessarily to have a political opinion, but to evaluate the evidence and the facts. And so there's a case to be made for
Yes.
getting that into the classroom as well.
And to distinguish, back to Moynihan, between what we know and what we don't, and what's fact and what's opinion, right? And so in the last book that I wrote, it's about the teaching of controversial issues. I had to decide what a controversy was. That is, what's a controversy that any of us or any of you should present in your classroom? And what we decided was that controversy is something where the best informed people disagree. So is it a controversy? Is it a controversial statement to say that human behavior has warmed the earth? It is not, okay? Because the best informed people all agree that human behavior has warmed the earth. Now, they don't agree what to do about that, right? There is a huge controversy about that. I think the problem that some of us on the left make is that we conflate these two things. And so we think that the statement, we should remain in the Paris Accord, has the same knowledge valence as human beings have warmed the earth. And it doesn't. And that contributes to the erosion of expertise that you're referring to.
We have time for, yes, one more question, yes. Right, yes, thank you.
So, kind of going off of the point of like the professors, but as a student, sometimes coming from like a biochemistry background, I often find it difficult when I'm in like a sociology or anthropology or global studies class to bring my opinion into the mix, because there is honestly a lot of times one secular opinion within the class, and I often feel like I kind of digress from that by bringing in a diverse like perspective of like throughout my other disciplines. How, as a student, when you're faced with that type of atmosphere, how are you able to actually voice your opinion without being like? Because I often feel like I'm gonna be targeted or be like castigated outside just for like my opinion, which might have like a whole backing through other onslaughts of disciplines. Like, how can I bring that into perspective for other students and have them maybe not agree with my idea, but also just have them willing to like see my side of things?
Just to clarify, you mean you're sort of bringing in sort of scientific knowledge to bear on sort of the softer humanistic fields?
I'm doing
Okay.
public health, and
Yeah.
so let's say we're talking about a public health issue and then we're looking at like the hospital structuring. How do we bring in medical side of things, looking at more of a like a hard science perspective into the social science where you're bringing in emotion? I guess this goes for the long run. How do you kind of like allow for collaboration across different groups while creating like a welcoming environment where people don't feel like their opinion is going to be an outcast?
Well, I'm just depressed that you feel that way. No,
Yeah.
and I'm not, I mean, I really am. I mean, to me, what you're expressing represents, it's antithetical to what I think a university should be. I don't know the specifics of your circumstance or what episode you're talking about, but if you feel in any way inhibited or you feel that your perspective can't be shared in a class, all of us have a problem. I can't say I know the solution to the problem, but as per the cliche, I think that the first step is to recognize that you've got one.
So do you just self-censor, or do you express yourself, but it doesn't? You self-censor, really? But how do you know that it's going to be received badly then?
Once you're in the conversation, I think it's more when you're in the conversation and you know the majority of the opinion of people who are speaking
Oh,
out.
yeah, right.
It's more the people who are expressing themselves, and then you
Right.
feel a need to also express your side to give another perspective, but then you feel this like backlash of what you might face in response.
Because you're fearful that that you'll offer something and that they'll say, they'll just dismiss you. Okay.
One of the, oh, go ahead.
You might be surprised, right? I mean, if you tried it, right? I mean, if you took the risk.
So how do you allow students to feel like they're able to do that? Because I think a lot of students who are the ones that are quiet are almost scared of giving their opinion on that. How do you create an environment, like as a professor, to allow these students to voice their opinion?
No, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I don't have a great answer to that question. But I mean, I think it's one thing that's important, and one thing small colleges can do is build friendship and trust between students, because the classes are small. So I've started taking my students out. I used to take them out to dinner at the end of the semester, and now I take them at the very beginning.
Yeah. Including my daughter, by the way. Just saying. Yeah.
And I think that's, it is important to build that sort of level of social comfort and trust and camaraderie. So it's a small suggestion, but
I think pedagogically there are things you can do. So especially in law, where there's always two sides, and you can say, hey, you're thinking about, or 4 or 8 or 22, you can say, hey, you're thinking about law. You don't always, your client is your client, and you might have to make an argument you don't like. So we're going to, I'm going to assign sides, and you get the side that's the unpopular one. And people get competitive, especially legal studies majors. And so one thing is to assign the sides of the argument, just randomly. Another time I've had great success with this was I just taught a class on Hamilton because I couldn't get a ticket to Hamilton. And so I figured, why don't I get 80 tickets to Hamilton, and then I can go. And so this had history, political theory, theater arts, critical race theory, and we were all in the same classroom. And so we had a panel of people who told us what to read, and we had guest professors and stuff. And it really went a long way. This goes to your humility point. I know nothing about the theater except for that I like to sing off-key, loudly, alone. And so my ability to say, when the theater professor came in and said something, I'm like, oh, wait, I don't know what that word means. And so you're modeling humility and wanting to learn what that is. And so I think interdisciplinary classes are one of the great places where this can happen, because we can start with the idea that we're bringing different sets of knowledge. And it was great, because when we did history, the historians were kids were the expert. And when we did theater, the theater kids were experts. And when we did, social theory, the sociologists were. So I think with the right kind of pedagogical tools, and there's a lot of research about this, it can be done.
I mean, I think the other thing your question shows is that students' discomfort is not always driven by politics, right? It could just be hard. You didn't feel like a political minority. You felt like an intellectual one.
Yeah.
And it speaks just to the general power of majority opinion.
Yeah.
Kurt.
I want to reiterate and follow up on Trey's question, because I think it's important. I don't think we quite got there. So I think what she was asking was that there are implications to what we've deemed microaggressions, which go beyond psychology. For example, the narrative that black males are violent isn't really a question about personal harm if that issue comes up. And so the question perhaps, particularly for Professor Zimmerman, is when that comes up, isn't there sort of an intellectual and communal duty to challenge that through some mechanism? And if it's not going down the sort of harm path, which I think personalizes it and thus makes it helpful in some instances, but what is a better sort of, as we pursue truth, what is a better mechanism from your standpoint to get at sort of the potential for real issues that come from what we deemed microaggressions?
Look, we live in a society that is hugely unequal. It's become more unequal in every way we can measure since the 1970s. It's riven by racial prejudice and fantasy of every kind. It would be a fantasy to imagine that that would not enter our colleges and our classrooms, okay? It does, all right? That's not an interesting question, at least not to me. The interesting question is what to do about it, right? And I would suggest to you, sir, your own metaphor, that your job as an instructor is to challenge everything that your students say. Your job is to ask another question, is to say, now, you seem to think that black males are prone to criminality. Can you tell me more about that? Like, where are you getting that message? Why do you believe that? What's the evidence for that claim? But note that everything I said doesn't actually have to do with how somebody's feeling. It actually has to do with reason and logic and evidence. And it seems to me that that's where we have to play. Look, we've got 2 Berkeley products here, and they know that Arlie Hochschild wrote this brilliant book 30, 40 years ago called The Managed Heart, where she talked about this thing called feeling rules. And feeling rules are the social scripts that influence without determining what we do feel. So feeling is a subjective state, as you were talking about, and the questioner as well. But nevertheless, there are scripts around us that influence without determining what we feel. My fear, my feeling, if you will, is that this feeling metaphor, in an Arlie Hochschild kind of self-fulfilling prophecy kind of way, is going to promote even more of the ill feelings that already exist. I don't know how that's a win for any of us. So to take a very concrete example, you may have read, say, 3-4 years ago, somebody broke into Harvard Law School and defaced the portraits of the faculty of color, put pieces of black tape across their mouths. And one of the portraits was of Randall Kennedy, who was a famous professor at Harvard Law School. And he wrote an op-ed about this a few days later because it had created this huge contretemps outside of Harvard. And all these students, not just students of color, are demonstrating, again, talking about the incredible harm that they suffered because of this racist act. Well, Kennedy in his op-ed made 2 points, one of which is boring and the other is interesting. The first one is boring, but we can't gloss over. He said, oh, excuse me, we don't know that this was a racist act. Could have been, probably was, but we don't know who did this. It could have been a piece of performance art. It could have been somebody going in trying to call attention to the muzzling of black voices. We don't know, but we immediately went to that. And that is a problem, you know? And then he said, secondly, what are we teaching people by publicly scripting a huge emotional injury from this single act? Is that going to be good for them, for any of our students? He said, we're at Harvard. Things could be a little worse. We are at Harvard, okay? And by the way, there's all sorts of, to go back to Neil's point about macroaggressions, there are all sorts of absolutely tangible inequalities and oppressions that we can point to that don't hinge on one's subjective experience of them, but that which you can actually look up. If you're born into certain circumstances, your likelihood of experiencing opportunity is much lower than other circumstances. That's not a microaggression, that's a macroaggression, all right? And you don't need to talk about people's feelings to document it. It's real. It's not subjective, it's objective.
Well, Patrice.
Just, do the other two panelists want to wrap up with last thoughts?
I'm happy to have field more questions. I'm not sure I have any, but it's whatever we want to do.
Take one more?
Let's take one more. That sounds great. Sandy.
So we've gone to the micro level, and I'd like to go back to the macro level that you started with, which is we all saw what happened in Middlebury. We've seen what's happened at Berkeley. What is, in fact, your views on the college response to invitations to, and we know what you said about Heather McDonald. What is or what should be the college's response to the invitations to campus by people who are either provocateurs, in the Milo case, or very far to the left or very far to the right, in terms of providing an audience, in terms of providing security, in terms of providing space on campus for all sorts of things. We now know that it is people on the right who are mostly kept from speaking on campuses. If we were going to have this very conversation during the 1950s, of course, it would have been people on the left who were not allowed to speak on campus. So I don't think there's a political question. I think it's a question really of how does the college, how does the university find an open space for free dialogue?
I think the Milo case at Berkeley is really interesting. A student group invited him. Would anyone like to guess, aside from the people I already told, how many people were in that student group? At UC Berkeley, some ginormous number of students. Any guesses? 11. It was 11 students who wanted to invite him. He didn't actually really get an invitation. They sort of created on Twitter the idea that there was going to be this campus free speech week that it's all very ambiguous. Then he showed up. Do you want to know how much it costs the University of California, Berkeley, which is in debt? $800,000 in extra security. And so I think there are real questions, and things have changed. You can assemble a group of people that require a lot of police presence really quickly with Twitter. And things have changed. And so I think there have to be systems for invitations. Doesn't mean you're deciding on the content of what they're going to say, but you think about what's the venue. I was supposed to debate the Westboro Baptist one time, and we couldn't do it because of death threats. My kids were all excited, and at some point I'm like, I can't take you because there are death threats, and it eventually got canceled because the venue wasn't right. I think we have to think seriously about how much spending $800,000 for somebody to appear in Sproul Plaza for 15 minutes uninvited interferes with the education of everyone at Berkeley. So there are these trade-offs, and there are really, to use the First Amendment kind of language, time, place, and manner kinds of restrictions that I think are perfectly reasonable for universities to have. And we haven't talked about it yet, but there's also a difference between the public kind of debate like we're having here and what happens in a classroom, right? So at Northwestern, we just had a big brouhaha because somebody invited an INS, is that right? Yeah, INS agent to speak to her class, and her class was all down for it. But the other people on campus were very, very upset. So it was a violence to them that the person was on campus because they're undocumented. Anyway, I think there are ways to deal with these kinds of things, but it means more attention and not sort of pretending like, oh, well, free speech, it'll just work out. We've got to guide it and provide the right platforms and venues and other kinds of events to help. Well, at the university, it's the university. It's the general counsel.
I mean, you bet. Well, on the theme of guidance, I mean, I think one group of folks on campuses that does not have much guidance are the young conservative activists. As my colleague Steve Tellis put it once, they're more or less being raised by wolves, because they don't. There aren't many conservative professors on campus who can, I think, direct them to sort of more responsible choices, and so as they're learning to become conservatives and conservative activists, they're turning to some of the most sensationalist populist figures out there, and so they invite Milo and Ann Coulter and the rest of them. Sometimes, too, I wonder if those folks serve as a kind of an instrument of social revenge. They sort of feel alienated from the institution, and so they want to bring these folks in who are just going to puke all over the institution. And so I think we need to do something about the alienation of conservatives from the university. I think we see that in other ways, too. I think we see it in their major choice. Politics is among the best predictors of major choice, and so conservatives really tend to opt out of the humanities and social sciences, which suggests that they're really alienated from this whole side of the college. Except for economics, and that's the exception that proves the rule, right? In some ways, because in economics you have much more diversity, and it's a much more moderate.
No, you don't. Just FYI.
You have more center-right people,
right?
Yep. And you have, it's a discipline that's been, of course, very influenced by conservative and liberal thinkers in a way that's not true of history and sociology and some other disciplines. So I think we need more diversity in the university, I think, so that these students can be really mentored and directed toward better sorts of choices and away from the Milos of the world.
And if I can just add my 2 cents to this, I'll just add as an addendum that I think that it is time to consider having the federal government subsidize security costs for public universities that have to deal with these massive protests. I think there's a real risk that many schools will spend down funds that they could use for other very good purposes to deal with these issues. And I think there's some chance that a number of the provocateurs who are coming to campus have as one of their goals, that very spend down. And so I think some sort of federal offset could be extremely helpful in that regard. Do we have last thoughts? If not, I think that we will thank our panelists for a very engaging and wonderful conversation.
Great.
Very good.
I just add my thanks to you all. Professor Zimmerman, I have to say I do have feelings right now. I'm feeling a little unsettled by all of this, but I hope that, yeah, and I hope that those in the room take that outward and continue the conversation, because I think one of the difficulties is we don't always talk about difficult issues. So I hope that this is the beginning of a conversation, that we continue it, and again, I thank you all for coming out. Good night.